right? The wars of apostasy. Now, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he noted, because he was involved in the battles, he was out there, he noted that a number of those who had memorized large portions of the Quran, they call them the Qurra, they were dying in the battles. So he went to Abu Bakr and said, we have a problem here. Those who had memorized larger portions are dying. We need to do something. We need to collect this Quran into one text before it gets lost and we end up like the Christians and the others. Now, Abu Bakr, when Omar suggested this to him, his response was, no way. I'm not going to do something which Prophet Muhammad ﷺ didn't do. I'm not prepared to do that. So Omar had to reason with him, sit with him, talk to him, until eventually he was able to win him over, to understand, yes, Allah referred to the Quran as Kitab. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is the book in which there is no doubt. So Allah referred to the Quran as a book. What was the intent of Prophet ﷺ in having the scribes write this thing down? To preserve it. So putting it into one text was only fulfilling what the Prophet ﷺ had asked them to do. Now, we should also note that large numbers, as we said, of those who were memorized large portions of the Quran were dying in the battles. This is something significant. They were in the front lines of the battles. Why? Because what they memorized of the Quran impacted in their lives in such a way as to make them want to be in the front lines of the battle. They were driven when Allah promises that He has bought from the believers their souls with the payment of paradise. They believed it, and that's why they were in the front lines of the battle. Big difference between that and us today, where we'll have people memorize the whole Quran. They don't even understand what a single word of it says. You know, this has become our tradition now. Memorize the Quran. Why? Because one who memorizes the Quran is able to take 7 of the family members into paradise. So, okay, I'm going to get my son to memorize Quran, so I'm covered. I can live a enjoyable life as long as my son is Hafiz. We're covered. He's going to intercede, carry us all into paradise. Of course, as one of the brothers in England was telling me, who works in the prisons in the north of England, where most of the Indo-Pakistanis who emigrated to England ended up. He said, in almost every single prison that he went to in the north of England, there was a Hafiz. A Hafiz in the prisons. Not as a chaplain treating the prison, no, as a criminal arrested. You know, and he said, you know, it's amazing that the others, the Sikhs and the Hindus, they would be in there for what they call white-collar crimes, right? You know, they fraud but the Muslims, they were in there for the big crimes, murder, you know, drugs, rape, you know, all these, the big crimes, that's what they were in there for. And in almost every prison, there was a Hafiz. His parents had had him go memorize the whole Quran, believing he was going to get everybody to paradise, and then let him loose. You know, and he ended up a criminal like the other people around him. You know? So alhamdulillah, the brother was in there, you know, trying to bring him back. But what is this telling us? It's telling us that memorizing the Quran in this way, this was not the intent. This is not the goal. This was not the way of the Salaf, the way of the early generation of righteous Muslims, the Sahaba and their students. This was not their way. As they relate to us, we didn't used to memorize more than 5 verses or 10 verses of the Quran at a time. And we did not move on to another set until we had understood all of what Allah commanded us in these verses, and we are trying to apply it. We learned knowledge and faith, iman, ilm wa iman at the same time. That's how they learned the Quran. And that's why when they memorized large portions, they ended up in the front lines of the battle. It had an impact. Not like us, as I said today, where we memorize huge portions of the Quran, we don't understand a single word of it. So Abu Bakr, after being convinced, he and Omar decided to go to Zayd ibn Thabit to get him to do the job. And his reaction was the same as Abu Bakr. He refused until he was convinced. And there is significance in this also, that when Abu Bakr this was first suggested to him, he refused because Prophet ﷺ didn't do it. Similarly, Zayd ibn Thabit did the same. This was how concerned they were about not introducing anything in the religion. Very, very concerned. Today, we are very lax. So you will find, for example, in the masjids today, lines on the floor showing you where you should stand. People say it's a good thing. It helps us to straighten our lines, get straight lines. Is it really a good thing? Is it really a good thing? Now, was that need to straighten the lines, did that need exist in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? Yes, it did. Were they able to draw a line in the sand or in the gravel so people could line up? Were they able to do it? Yes. So why didn't the Prophet ﷺ do it? If it's a good thing for the prayer, and this is part of the ibadah now, because Prophet ﷺ said, straightening the salah is a part of the salah, part of completing the salah. So this is an act of ibadah. Straightening up these lines is an act of ibadah. So why didn't the Prophet ﷺ do it? Why instead did he turn, check the people in the line, tell them straighten up, straighten your lines, come close together, and tell everybody to look and check? And why? Because this process is a part of training the ummah in following leadership, in cooperating, working together to establish this thing. This is training. So as the scholars of the past said, whenever you bring alive a bid'ah, you kill a sunnah. So now the imams, to straighten the line, they don't need. The lines are already on the floor, everybody gets in lines up. He maybe turns just a glance this way, glance that way. Allahu Akbar. So that whole sunnah of straightening the lines is lost. And that's why we say that lines in the masjid are bid'ah. The establishment of these lines and the carpets with the lines, this is bid'ah. Not a bid'ah hasana. As the Prophet ﷺ said, every bid'ah is dalala. Every innovation is misguidance. So, the companions were very, very careful about not allowing any new things to enter into the practice of the deen. They chose Zayd, why? Because he was one of the best reciters of the Quran. Because he was one of the few who had memorized the whole Quran during the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime. He was with the Prophet ﷺ when he recited the Quran twice in the last Ramadan of his life. And he was also one of the scribes of the Prophet ﷺ who wrote the revelation down. So they chose him. The best qualification, best qualified. And he gathered around himself those who had memorized all or most of the Quran, and those who had written, gathered up all the materials, and he began the process of compiling it on one text, which was out of goatskin. When he finished writing it down, he gave it to Caliph Abu Bakr. And that was all within the first year after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Within 1 year's time of his death, the whole Quran was written down in a single text. When Abu Bakr died, and he died 2 years after that of the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he turned it over before his death to Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar ibn al-Khattab, he kept it with him throughout his reign until he was stabbed in prayer. And prior to his death, he turned it over to his daughter Hafsa, who was one of the wives, or former wives of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And she kept it with her in her home. During the early part of the reign of Uthman, people used to come, make copies from it, and compare what they had with what was written there. And midway through the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, one of the companions came to him by the name of Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman. He came to him and suggested that something needed to be done. There was a problem arising. The problem that a number of the companions, or people from different tribes, Arabian tribes, had begun boasting about their modes of recitation, because the Quran had been revealed in 7 modes. According to the 7 major tribes of Arabia, the Quran was revealed in 7 different ways. And some of these tribes began boasting amongst themselves about whose recitation or mode of recitation was best, and it was starting to create a kind of rivalry. And so Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman suggested to Uthman ibn al-Affan that something needed to be done. So Uthman, at this point, he called up the companions and decided to make official copies and send them out to the centers of Islam, because by then Islam had spread across Egypt, into Syria, into Iraq. It had gone into parts of India, in Russia, reaching China, up to Turkey. So Islam was spreading quite rapidly at this period. So what he decided to do was he got Zayd ibn Thabit to make 7 official copies and sent one of the copies to all of the various major centers of Islam at the time, along with a qari who would instruct on how the text should be recited. And at that time, he also decided, with the agreement of the major companions, to reduce the modes of recitation to the one main mode, which was that of the Quraysh, the main dialect of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Quran then was reduced to that one mode, and with the agreement of the companions, it was agreed that all other copies that people had, their personal copies, etc., would be burnt, and new copies for everybody would be made from the official copies that were sent. This was with the agreement of Muslims in all the major areas. Now, it's important to stop for a minute on that point and address an issue which some of the Orientalists and missionaries tried to raise concerning the Quran's authenticity. And they say, after admitting that by the 3rd century, when Trinitarian Catholic bishops had won the struggle over the Unitarian bishops, right? Unitarians like Arius and others, they were defeated in the Council of Nicaea by vote, and the Trinitarian concept, the 3 gods in one, became the rule, and they chose now Gospels which somehow implied or had texts which could be used and interpreted to support this concept. They at the same time declared that all other texts were apocryphal and they must be burnt. Anybody caught with these texts would be executed. So they went around the Christian Empire, Holy Roman, so-called Holy Roman Empire, and they burnt all of these other texts. So this process and this practice, in terms of their own history, implies that certain other texts which were out there that were just as authentic historically as the existing texts, these were systematically eliminated. Copies were kept in the Vatican. That was it. They want to compare that and say, okay, just as this happened to us and changes took place, the same thing happened to you Muslims with your Quran. In the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, they burnt the other texts. There's difference. It's a big difference. In the time of Uthman, that burning took place with the consent. They were not hunting people down and killing anybody who were caught with these other texts, and it was, no. They agreed and personally did their own burnings. Right. They said, hey, we found it. No, your Quran is not that one Quran that you're claiming all along. We found one with variants. Till this day, he has not produced it, what the variants are, so that it could be analyzed. What he claims are variants. Are they variant readings, which is well known? There are different recitations which were known and recorded. Or are they in fact scribes' mistakes? If you find all over the Muslim world one consistent text, and you bring one text from one location where there are variations, what do you do with that? You'll have to say this is error. This individual, if it wasn't variant readings, then there was errors made by this scribe. You don't hold this up now and going to equate it to what exists in the rest of the whole Muslim world, from Tashkent, manuscripts from the first 100 years after the time of Prophet Muhammad to the Topkapi Museum, to all the other locations where they have ancient manuscripts from the first century, first 2 centuries. You can't do that. So that argument is a red herring, so to speak. So the reality is that the Quran has remained